I'm Dr. Jayana Abbott, and I am the interim founding director of the Faculty Engagement and Development Office of the Provost. And so glad you guys are all here. Today is our first in a series of Year of the Teacher, and these are headed up by Dr. Dusya Vera, who you'll meet in just a minute. And today is a panel discussion. It's best and favorite practices of the art and science of teaching. And we are so fortunate to have three of the past UH Distinguished Leadership in Teaching Award winners. This is an amazing award, and I will talk to you a little bit about that in a second. So we have Dr. David Mazella from English. He is the 2014 award recipient. We have Dr. Dusya Vera from Management. She is this year's award recipient. And we have Dr. Sandra Guerra Thompson from the law, and she is the 2015 award recipient. And I've been fortunate enough to have been impacted by each one of these individuals throughout my career here at the University of Houston, so extra happy to have them here today as well. So let me tell you a little bit about the Teaching Excellence Award, the Distinguished Leadership in Teaching Excellence Award. This award is very, very special because you have to have won almost every award in teaching prior to being able to be nominated for this award. So it's not like you could just be nominated. You have to have won everything else, and then they have this amazing award for you afterwards. If you get that, if you're lucky enough to get there. So nomination is accepted for the tenure faculty. It's also for non-tenure track faculty with continuing employment agreements. You can be associate or full professor. This is the important part. It's a person who has made a sustained and significant contributions to education within the context of their responsibilities as a full-time faculty member. It's a prize of $25,000, $15,000 cash award to the recipient themselves, and you give a $10,000 cash award to your department to be used for, for professional development and other things in your department. It is given for somebody in recognition of the finest among the University of Houston's full-time faculty for demonstrated educational excellence in teaching and in scholarship of teaching and learning. So you can tell this is a really high award. So we're very, very lucky to have these three people to share their teaching tips and practices. I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves and tell us a little bit, and maybe give us, you'll share one of their favorite tips on teaching. So we'll start with that, and then I've got a couple of other questions, and I'll open it up to all of you guys, because I know you probably have lots of questions. You want to start, David?
So I've been here about 22 years, and I've decided when I came here, I had no intention of becoming an award-winning teacher. It didn't occur to me that that would happen. But it really was just a matter of me trying to teach the best I could in really a somewhat unfamiliar environment. I taught in New York before, but I came here, and there were certain overlaps, but then also differences between adult ed, basically, that I taught in at Columbia in general studies, and then the kind of student body that we had here. But I think I was like most people in my department, moving ahead, trying to do the best I could, and then getting more reflective about it as I went along. But what I did notice as I began to do that was that there were certain recurring things that became more and more important to me to highlight as I taught, and really to begin to tell myself as I began to sort of think about teaching. And I discovered that it was useful to sort of work on my own in terms of my own sort of reflective writing and my own sort of work thinking about courses, course development, curricular stuff, which is really the stuff that I like to do best. And then that sort of moved me eventually into running sort of an early precursor of this called the CTE a few years ago, and that was the sort of reason why I think I was given the Distinguished Leader Prize. But should we sort of start talking now, or should we just
Nope,
move on?
just we're going to go to the next person, and then we'll come back and I'll ask you the other questions.
My name is Dusya Vera. I am originally from Ecuador, and I came to UFH in 2002. This is my first job out of the PhD program, and I'm still here. And happy to be here, very grateful to be here. I teach classes in leadership. I teach global leadership, ethical leadership, positive leadership. I also teach classes in strategy, global strategy, business strategy, strategy for oil and gas. I teach in person, I teach online. I take students, with my colleagues, we take students to Berlin every year, study abroad trips. I have also joined the Prague study abroad trip, the Chile study abroad trip. And so mostly my classes are in those topics, leadership and strategy. And I'll tell you a little bit more, but the method that I usually use is the case method, so a lot of engagement, a lot of discussions and conversations.
Hello, I'm Sandra Guerra Thompson. I'm at the law school, as was mentioned, and I've been there since 1990. And I think one of the things I wanted to share with you is I think I'm sort of unique in that my being here was completely unpredictable when I started teaching. And I think that's the most useful thing I could do is share with you how it is that I went from starting out teaching criminal law when I was, like, I don't know, 27 or something, and not knowing what I was doing, and not doing a very good job at it, I gotta say, and to where I am today. And I think if I had to sum it up, I guess I would say that one thing is I worked really hard at it. I mean, and people will say, we work hard, but I mean, I actually tried to learn about teaching. Like, I engaged in, a deliberate attempt to learn how to teach. And so I went to conferences for law teachers and where you learn tips on how to teach. And I formed a committee at the law school to try to improve the teaching across the law school. But it was really just for myself, right? So I stepped up and volunteered to do this, and I brought in people from the education department and from different departments. And I called on some of the best law teachers to put on programs because I wanted to learn how to teach better. And so I engaged in this really like 10-year quest to improve what I was doing. And at the end of the day, I think what I came away with is a sense of my role as serving my students. That's my primary function, is to serve my students. And to be very professional about it. And I think when I started out, I wanted them to like me. And then what I realized was that that was the wrong goal, that I shouldn't want to be liked. I should just worry about serving them, and if I do that, then everything else falls into place. If I care about them, not try to make them think I care about them, but if I actually care about them, they will know that, and they will know that I respect them, and I could talk some more about that. But for me, that's really been the sort of the aha, is I'm here to serve them.
Great. So the first question I have for you guys is, could you share one or two of your favorite teaching tips or practices for engaging students? And then I'll add on another part of that is, how does this change depending on class sizes, or does it? Or maybe in your case, do say class types.
I guess that, English tends to teach smaller classes, so I don't know if I've ever taught a class that was larger than 30.
Lucky.
Well, we read their writing. So,
Yeah, oh yeah.
So the expectation in an English class is that you are doing very, very careful reading and feedback on, rather rapidly sequenced kinds of assignments. But anytime that I have a class of any size, I actually always have a certain degree of in-class writing that is not graded, but is just sort of scanned by me and kind of checked. And there are different ways to do this. In-class writing or low-stakes writing is really, really good for getting to know what's inside people's heads. And to me, the value of it is that even if students are rather rushed or hurried, the first thing that they say, it's almost like an association game, will tend to be the most pertinent thing. And it will be sort of a sign that they can make a connection, and then I can see them making the connection, and I can see where they're making their connection, at what level, and the content. And there are ways that you can do it in the beginning of class as a 2-minute or a 5-minute warm-up. You can do it at the end of a class as a kind of summary kind of exercise to see what they've learned. At the beginning of a lesson to kind of see how much they need to know, or at the end of a whole series of lessons so that you can see essentially how much they've been able to synthesize what you've taught them. So it's an extraordinarily versatile kind of technique, and essentially it serves the purposes of curiosity. I went for years without understanding what people knew as a result of my teaching, because I just relied on a few sort of official assignments that I would grade very carefully and give all sorts of feedback to that was never read. But being able to do this kind of more informal writing was very, very important to getting a sense of what was inside their heads, and then trying to figure out, well, okay, so what do I do to get them to do a little bit more? So in-class writing would be one of my favorite techniques.
And so as I said before, the method that I use for all my classes is the case method. And the case method means there is a story of a company or a leader or a person that has actually happened. And at the end of the case, there's a decision to be made. So the class goes all around this what would you do question. What would you do? And what would you do? And why would you do that? And who agrees with this person? Who disagrees with this person? So we spend, when I teach 6 to 9, we could spend 3 hours talking about a case. So I think that differentiates my classes from other classes in the sense that I don't lecture a lot. It's a lot of application and a lot of conversations in terms of what would you do and why and how and who agrees, who disagrees. So I think students find that appealing, because the other thing that I try to always create is, and I put a lot of emphasis on that, is that we're gonna practice being non-judgmental. And at the beginning they think I'm crazy. It's like, what is she talking about being non-judgmental? We are judgmental the whole day. But I believe in that personally, so I try to, really, what is the word for that? To represent it, to embody it. We're gonna try to be non-judgmental for 13 weeks or for 7 weeks. We're gonna show what being non-judgmental is about. And that means when somebody says something, we're gonna be like, yes, and we're gonna build on each other's ideas where nobody's right, nobody's wrong, we'll have different opinions, and we're gonna exchange those opinions without going to right or wrong or good or bad. This is a good idea, this is a bad idea, this is a right idea, this is a wrong idea. We're gonna really listen. And I get a lot of feedback about that, because a lot of times students are like, we have no idea that this opposite or very different perspective would even be available. Or people say, I would have not said this in any other class, but here I feel I can say it. I can say it in this environment, or I can say it in front of you, or I can say it in front of them, because I feel nobody's gonna shut me down, or nobody is gonna say that I am dumb or whatever. So those are the two things that are very important for me. One, creating conversations. So my colleagues sometimes tease me because they say, that I teach by facilitating discussions. Like, it's not that I don't teach by necessarily dumping, books, book concepts, but it's a lot of, me being there moderating a discussion. But it's a lot of fun for me to do it. And I think, I manage the flow in a way that at the end we get to the point that I want them to get to. But it has been a lot of coming in from them, not coming from me. So that a lot of the learning is coming from the students, not from me. And the other thing is creating this environment. So at the end of the semester, I tell them, okay, we finished the class. Now you can go back to being judgmental, and in your life. And sometimes I get comments, no, we really like this environment. I'm gonna try to keep practicing, just being more open-minded. And not necessarily always think that I'm right or wrong or good or bad. So those are two of the, I think, characteristics of my classes.
Sandra? So the evolution of my criminal law class, when I started, the model that I had was similar to what you might have seen on the movie The Paper Chase, right? Of a professor who gets up and talks about a case and asks students, grilling the students, have they read, and recite the facts for me. And it's this kind of exchange, and that was, sort of how I was taught in law school too. And so I got up and I felt like I had to be that person, and I wasn't really being myself, for one thing, and secondly, it was really hard for the students to understand what I was trying to do. And criminal law is basically applied philosophy. It's about human nature and why people do what they do, and the judgments that we're gonna bring upon them, and how we want to treat them. There are a lot of social problems. And then it's also very technical, where I want them to get excited about reading the statute and the language in the statute and understanding whether the facts of this case are, meet the requirements of this particular statute. And so both of these things are things that, most students would find very dull. Philosophy and technical reading of statutes. To me, it was exciting, and I could really see how it applied to what they were going to do in practice. But what the evaluation said was, you're not teaching us what we need to know to practice. And I thought they were just dumb. I was so frustrated with them that they couldn't see how perfectly this aligned with what they were going to do in practice. And they couldn't see why I wanted them to learn all this, Ivy League, or, I'm just up in my ivory tower kind of thing, academic stuff that had no application in the real world. And so, like I said, I went to these conferences and I started learning about student learning styles and techniques. And the funny thing is that I learned things like, use overhead slides. Right now it would be called PowerPoint. Use problems, break students up into groups and have them work on problems. These were the really innovative concepts for law teachers. And when I told my mother and sister, who worked in elementary and high school, they laughed, right? Because they're like, that's what we always do in elementary school. And so I started doing these things because I realized that PowerPoint was going to help students who learned more visually. I started recording my classes and making the recordings available to students who had to miss class or who missed a concept in the lecture and wanted to go back and listen to it again. That was a surprise. I didn't realize that they would do that, but they would. They go back and they re-listen to the classes. But what I found was I sort of stumbled upon the fact that I could retool my class and incorporate problems and incorporate prosecutorial ethics, which is another concept that was very important to me, and get them to role play. And in so doing, I got them to do everything that I wanted, and they now thought that this was a very practical class. And I actually was able to elevate the level at which they were performing beyond my wildest expectations by repackaging the class, because what I didn't want to do was to lecture. I certainly didn't want to just spoon feed them. I didn't want to dumb it down. I didn't want to just tell them how this was applicable. But rather by doing these class projects and problems in class where they were going to argue a motion before the judge and explain why the facts, do meet the statute's requirements or not, right, as a prosecutor, as a defense lawyer. I got them to do that role play in class. They worked so hard for my class because, I wanted to make them work hard, and I thought when I started out that if I did the John Houseman paper chase, tell me what the facts are, it just didn't work for me because it's not my personality. And being false just didn't work. I had to be myself, but I wanted to make them work hard, and this really motivated them to work a lot harder. And I found a lot of success in that.
Cool. So something that y'all haven't talked about yet, maybe a little bit in the beginning, but what are some steps that you take for developing relationships with your students, and how do you show them that you're interested? So not relationships like outside of the classroom, but in the classroom. Should really make sure I clarify that.
So, part of this whole language of engagement, which is very tricky,
Yeah.
because there's kind of a false engagement and genuine engagement. And students are very, very sharp and perceptive when they know that you are just kind of phoning it in. But, I mean, as somebody who kind of shows up at work, sometimes, with 3 hours sleep and having, done something else and working on all this and doing that, you do arrive sometimes distracted, and what that should do is give you a more charitable attitude towards your students and their levels of, exhaustion and distraction and the rest of it, which is I think always present in a kind of commuter student population like what we have, for the most part. So having some sympathy for that actually does help in terms of that trust building that you're talking about. And then trying very, very hard to communicate very, very precisely what your expectations are and what kind of work they need to do to approach that. Makes a huge difference. And I wasn't very good at this when I started, because no one is. Because you kind of come out of an R1, or a 40-20 research program, and everyone's working way up here, and they kind of laugh at you if you try to explain too much. But if you go, if you're doing undergraduate teaching, you have to be able to communicate what you're doing, what you want, what you expect immediately, and you have to keep doing that until everybody in the room knows what you're talking about. Because if you don't, somebody's just shut down. So that's one of the ways. Good communication is really, really just absolutely indispensable for that kind of trust building and to kind of get a productive relationship, which you can sometimes lose if you are inconsistent or whatever. And sometimes you have to kind of work back to get to there. But communication is really key.
I think in terms of engagement or connecting to students, two things that I believe in. One is this idea of compassion with accountability, which I think it's what you're calling, empathy, sympathy, or empathy especially for whatever situation. So I play a lot around with that concept of compassion and accountability, because sometimes I have erred in personally and in my career, sometimes it's too much compassion. I think at Bauer, I'm known for being compassionate with students, but of course I can go I went to the extreme of compassion when I was director of the PhD program. I had all the PhD students in my office all the time. Some of them were crying, and I was supporting them. I was very happy to do that, but I realized the hours of the day were going by with one student after the other crying in my office, which was too much. So, and then I play with this idea of what about compassion with accountability, for ourselves and for others. This idea of everybody's doing the best they can, and at the same time, we want to get things done. We are responsible for things. We have to get deliverables. We have to get outcomes. So that is one philosophy that I think people would describe me, my students would describe me as very compassionate, but at the same time they know that I care about the deadlines, I care about getting things done, and I care about what they learn. The other aspect of the question that you ask is this idea of authenticity that Sandra mentioned before. I do care also a lot about authenticity in the sense that being this, and we have talked about this at Bauer too, Vanessa, Patrick is here, this idea of being the same person at home and at work. And that is a philosophy that I think I strongly believe in. And I tell my students, I don't want you to be one person at home and then another person at work. That's exhausting, like if you think at home, you can say and think whatever you want, and then at school or at work, you have to pretend to be somebody else, or you have to pretend to behave. That's exhausting. That it's hard to keep track what you say if you are not the same person everywhere you are. So I think the students feel that I relate to them or I communicate easily to them, because in my classes, I think they know that in addition to teaching them strategy or to teaching them leadership, I do want them to be happy people. I do want them to be happy, productive people. I care about their well-being, not just the strategy and leadership. So it doesn't matter what I teach. I manage to have always a class where a question will come out, which is, what is the meaning of success? and for my MBA student, that is a question that they don't always think about. So the meaning of success for a lot of our students is, I want to make money. I want to make a lot of money. So for them, they think it's a trivial question. But then when people start thinking really, what is the meaning of success? when I am 90, what will it have meant that I am successful or not? How are you going to measure that? And students start actually opening up and talking about things that are not making money, things that are very far away from that area. I think they realize, we're having some students say, oh, this class is like therapy, and it's an MBA class. So I think that is, I don't, like the same as Sandra said, I don't make any effort to show them that I care. I just try to be authentic in the sense that I care about happiness, I care about what is success for people. I care about being the same person wherever you go, because if not, it's too tiring and life is too short. And I think that I communicate that in the classes, and they think it's helpful to at least have that space to create that conversation.
So I've tried a lot of things, and again, sometimes I tried because I wanted to be popular, and that wasn't the best motivation. And what I found, some things work, some things don't work. Authenticity is very important. So one of the things I like to do is I always start my classes, my larger classes, with a talk. And I try to inspire students and tell them why I'm there. I tell them that I will be here every day on time, prepared, and that I expect the same from them. As far, I like your accountability and compassion. I sort of do that because one of the things I've struggled with was how do I call on students? And one method is they're always on call. Any day they can be randomly chosen and they can be put on the spot.
I do that too.
Or right, but I played around with it. You can have panels where only these 5 people are on call. I don't like that because then the other 50 people in the class aren't going to be prepared, and that's just true, right? Some people do this side of the room and then that side of the room, but you have the same problem. So what I finally decided to do was, no, everyone's on call, but if you have some reason, you were sick, whatever, you can email me before class that you'd like to pass. I said, but you have to fess up in advance that you're not ready. And they do, and I usually have about 5 people out of, right now I have 95 students, and I'll usually have about 5 who ask not to be called on. But then they know that I do care, right? That I'm not, gonna put them on the spot on days when they're not quite ready. I've tried parlor tricks like memorizing all their names before the first day of class and going around the room and saying, you're Kevin, you're David, you're, and after about the first day, I've forgotten them all, and it doesn't, it's phony, so I gave that up. I have a seating chart with their names, and I usually will learn a lot of their names over the course of the semester. One thing I stumbled on is having lunch in the student lounge. And I did it one semester when I was really busy, and I had a lot of students I didn't know in class, and I just said, I'm going to be in the lounge on Wednesday. Will some of you come and join me? Raise your hands if you could be there, and because I didn't want to be alone. So, a few people said yes, and I found that they really liked that. They really liked to have a chance to just sit and get to know their professor. And I was surprised because I thought, to me it's like, what's the big deal, But it seemed to be a big deal to them. And so, I just sort of played around with it, but again, authenticity is really important.
And with the names, but I don't have 95, I only have like 30 students, but I tell them to bring, to put your name cards in front. I don't do it in advance either. So I just tell them, if you keep just please bring your name card so that I can memorize your name. And I tell them, hopefully I'm thinking by week 3 or 4, I should know it. So it's just in a very casual way. I'm working on it. It's going to take me 3 to 4 weeks. So just keep bringing your name. And they do that, and eventually they stop bringing it, and I have memorized it after 3 or 4 weeks, and so we continue on. But they do remember that as the professor learned our names, but with 30 it's much easier than with 95.
Yeah.
So.
And I know Dusya does. This is kind of an extra question I'm throwing in. How do you do that in an online class? when you're teaching online?
The
So you said, yeah, the names, just developing a relationship with them. What different?
It is much harder, because also in Blackboard, we cannot put pictures. I took this online class where they were saying, but we had pictures actually in that environment, in that online environment. They could see my picture and I could see their pictures. And I asked, after taking that class, I asked the Blackboard people, why don't we have pictures? Let's have pictures. That way, it could be a way to connect. Plus, I could see them around the building. Plus, some of them have taken a class already. Or next time they take a class, they told me they couldn't, there was some privacy issue that the pictures couldn't be there. So that makes it much harder. Sometimes I do meet students who say, I took your online class and I have no idea who this person is because I don't have, I would have to, I guess I could go to PeopleSoft and try to, online is harder to connect. I don't know if you guys have any tip for that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't use Blackboard.
I knew that.
No, Blackboard is,
Which one do you use?
I use WordPress
He made up his own.
blogs.
Which one?
I use WordPress blogs, I use
Yeah.
the freebie WordPress stuff because it's cheap. And essentially, if something is usable by people who want to blog about kittens and yarn, students can probably handle the technical complexity of WordPress. And really, the only thing that I need for it with my kind of teaching is a forum, which actually is incredibly hard with Blackboard, but very, very easy in WordPress. And it enables them to kind of post questions, to give answers to questions, to post their annotated bibliographies and other kinds of research assignments online, and then share each other's research.
Yeah.
Which to me is the main.
But we can do that
Oh.
in Blackboard.
Yeah, but you still use Blackboard. So, I mean, I'm a big believer in cheap and easy when it comes to ed tech because it changes so quickly and it's so time consuming to learn that I would much rather either learn my discipline or learn more about my students. Learning Blackboard to me feels like it's just just sunken time. I'm just using up all this time. But the stuff that I do for engagement on Blackboard is really having them come up with their own questions. So one half of the class can come up with questions and the other half ends up sort of answering, and then to a certain extent, they develop a certain kind of rapport through reading each other and answering each other's questions that otherwise they don't get. So all the ways that you can get out of this role as super moderator and having the students themselves interact, I think is key for face-to-face and any kind of online interaction. So that kind of stuff to me is way more important than a lot of the other kinds of stuff that people want you to do on those forums.
No, and I miss seeing their faces in terms of the face-to-face, but yes, the conversation. Like I still ask them what is the meaning of happiness or the success in the online setting. So they get the same questions, and sometimes because it's more anonymous, they are more open to what they really want to say versus saying it in class. But it's just the face-to-face that it's hard to maintain.
Could I offer one thing?
Yeah. And y'all can jump
I'm not on
in.
the panel by any means, I'm here to hear, but for online, I know what I've done in the very beginning, because to make some sort of a connection where people feel like you are interested in knowing who they are, I would typically ask them to tell me something that they would share, of course,
Yeah, to
that
introduce
everyone would have
themselves.
access to. Yeah, something professional, something about the, professional in terms of what they think, once they get the degree, where they wanna go. Something academic, and then something personal.
Yeah.
And usually, when I'm corresponding on the first couple of times, and I'm trying to learn names too, and I don't have some faces, a lot of times, I will pinpoint one of those things, because that's how I remember who they are.
Yeah.
And when they're conversating. And they seem to appreciate that, because then eventually they'll tell me one more thing, why they really chose that profession. And then I'll say, this makes sense, and I'll tie back to something they told me that first introductory, yeah.
And so I'm gonna open it up for questions in just a second, but is there any advice, last minute advice, or not last minute, but just advice that you would like to share with the UH Powerhouse faculty today?
Well, I mean, again, I guess I would say that I believe that teaching, like writing, is a learned skill, and never to stop trying. just keep trying different things and asking for advice and watching other people. I have learned a lot by watching my colleagues. And actually, having won one of these awards, I've served on the committee, so I've watched people in other colleges teach, and it's just fascinating. But I guess I would just say to keep trying, never give up, because if you give up, this is what always haunted me. Is one of my former professors gave a talk about teaching, and he said that if you didn't teach well and students didn't like you, then you would have to run down the halls quickly and hide in shame. And so that's always haunted me. You don't want to be that person, right? You want to be the one that students say, oh, look, Mom and Dad, I'm graduating, and this is one of my professors who I really love. And that's, that's what we all want, right? We want to feel like we're doing a good job. So just keep trying.
The idea of watching others teach, definitely. When I was a PhD student, we had to do that. We had to go to each strategy professors, and we had to sit there and watch them teach. As a professor, also, I tell our PhD students, go to our department is Dr. DeFrank. Go to Dr. DeFrank to watch him teach, whoever it is. But definitely, and that's also a sense of humility, in the sense of, there is always something to learn from others. Yeah. It doesn't matter if you win an award or not. There is definitely a lot that we don't know, and there are fantastic professors around here. So definitely have the humility to ask for help. That's the other one, asking for help, because sometimes we are like, I shouldn't ask for help because I am a professor, associate professor, whatever you are, or I just won an award. How can I ask for help? No, asking for help. Go watch others and keep learning.
Well, this is the kind of thing that. This kind of event is the kind of thing that's really productive of imposter syndrome. Because you sort of wake up in the morning and you think, well, how am I going to talk about this when I don't necessarily feel like an award-winning professor today? And the answer is that, some days you're an award-winning professor, sometimes maybe you're not the award-winning professor. I mean, you have the same ups and downs that everybody else does. And so winning an award does not mean that you're immune to those things. And so, the 2 points that I always make when I'm talking to other teachers around here, the first is that pedagogy is highly disciplinary. In other words, your success or failure is very much about the domain that you work in, and it's framed in those terms. So English professors, people who do lit and lit studies, are very, very concerned about the quality of writing that they are offering to their students, that they're teaching their students how to read, and the kind of writing that they get their students to produce. And if it's not there, they're not doing their jobs, and they feel that sense of shame and failure. And so that is peculiarly disciplinary, but when you begin to get to these kinds of moments where you begin to talk to other teachers, you find out that, in fact, pedagogy is transdisciplinary. That there are all sorts of things you learn from other disciplines. The way that I'm learning about leadership, you're basically modeling leadership as you talk about leadership, and it's a kind of complex kind of performance, as you describe it. And you are sort of doing a similar kind of work with criminal law. You're kind of trying to embody it in a certain kind of way that appeals to people, and then also has the kind of intellectual refinement and complexity that you would demand. So we're all sort of working with a kind of disciplinary ideal, but then also we're aware of all the other kinds of knowledge that's getting produced and discussed and used around here at a university, and we can learn from both sides of that to improve our teaching. The last point that I always make is that there's a developmental arc for students, but there's also a developmental arc for teachers. And Gene Chiappetta of education, I hope he's not here, Gene once told me that it takes 10 years for people to learn how to even begin to think about their own teaching. And then I look back at my own history, it's like, well, yes, that's it, 10 years. It's 10 years of practice. And then somehow or other between year 10 and 15 is where you begin to be able to talk about it to other people. And so, sadly, I've been here long enough, I can start doing things like that. So, the developmental arc is about the young teacher and the problems of the young teacher, the mid-career, and those problems. And then, sometimes there are the questions of burnout or exhaustion or fatigue or distraction that come in with late career teachers as well. None of this stuff is is absolutely determined, but the institution can sort of channel people in particular kinds of ways, and as a teacher at every one of those stages, you need to be aware of what the pitfalls are of your particular developmental stage. So, I mean, one of the reasons why we need a Fed, or whatever it's going to be called, I don't know. One of the reasons why it's good to have things like this is that we can begin to think about that and really begin to use, you know, events like this and moments like this to kind of think a little bit about those developmental stages and what works for disciplines and across disciplines.
Well, thank you guys very much, but I want to open it up for questions. I'm just, so, do you guys have some questions for our panel? This is a great opportunity. Thank you, yes.
One of the things that I've noticed, got my PhD, went out in the field for 20 years, retired, and came back. So a lot of water has crossed under the bridge in the interim, between the time I taught before and now. One of the things I see right now is the students are very much cookie cutter. They want everything nice and neatly packaged and aligned, and I'm trying to get the students to think above that level, to think more conceptually and philosophically, because out in the field, things just don't come nice and neatly packaged and well-defined and all that.
What's your discipline?
Engineering. Do you have any suggestions on how you can get the students to kind of make that leap up? Because I think a lot of it from talking with teachers at the grade school level, I think they kind of get conditioned to that to a certain extent, you know, teaching to the test and all that, as I'm told. I guess that's my question. How can I get my students to kind of rise above to go to the next level?
I feel like that's the problem that I had with my students too. Is there a way maybe to break them up into groups in class and have them work on problems?
Well, I
To
mean,
exchange and, you know.
Well, that was the thing too, because I was listening when you were soliciting student interaction. Because I'll go and I'll set up scenarios and whatnot, and then I'll ask a question, and I'll pose it to the class, and it's just blank stares and silence.
Right.
I always keep saying that I'm gonna go get the little cricket app so I can play the little cricket sound there. So, other than just because I was trying to avoid, you know, actually calling, okay, Susie, okay, Billy Bob, Bobby Sue, all that. I was trying to get the students to be more spontaneous.
Yeah, that could be hard, but maybe if you say, you know, you're working on a team and you work for this company, and your job is to solve this problem, you know, they're producing this product. I don't really know engineering, but you know, whatever it is, like if there's some problem.
No, but you and the law is very similar. As far as, you know, law is not cut and dry.
Yeah, it's
I mean, you're gonna
applied.
have you're gonna have the various situations, and again, just like you were talking about mapping the scenario to case law and, you
Right.
know, precedent, all that. Engineering, I think, kind of fits that, to
Yeah,
an extent.
I would think so, because I mean, engineering is very creative. I'm married to an engineer, so I know like it's a creative process, and if they work separate, you know, in separate little groups, and then you can compare what they've done and see that this group came up with this solution and this other group came up with something different that's actually better, or just different, maybe not even better, but you know, that can be an aha moment for them too. I know that I learn. Right, and that's like one of the really interesting things is I teach the same stuff over and over and over, and every year, I tell the class, one of you at some point is going to say something in a different way that is going to blow my mind, right?
Yeah.
Like something new that I had never thought of, and it's really exciting.
I mean, can I tell a story? I was really kind of disappointed at certain points by my son's literature classes because they make them do things like memorize lists of rhetorical figures. I thought, oh God, there's no better way to just alienate everybody from their literature classes than memorizing lists of rhetorical figures. How could they do that? And so there were a whole series of really terrible assignments that were just memorization and lists and so forth. And this is the kind of cookie cutter thing where here's a list, now memorize it. Now give me the list. Okay, we're done. And that kind of learning, I mean, there is a certain kind of conditioning that takes place, and the teachers will attest to the rest of it. And then my daughter was doing debate, high school debate, and everybody turns up at the debate, and I see these kids with these huge files, and then on the spot they're doing things like arguing nuclear proliferation. and every kid sounds highly informed about nuclear proliferation in countries that I barely have heard about. And they're giving, and they're kind of pulling out the index cards and debating back and forth, and it's actually exciting to watch these kids, middle schoolers and high schoolers, suddenly marshalling evidence in ways that are way more sophisticated than anything I'd ever seen in a high school assignment they've been given. So they can do it, but they need a context. Sometimes it's a competitive thing. Competitive thing can do it, but where they need to persuade, where they need to use evidence, where they need to reason, they need to be able to argue, you give them those opportunities, and suddenly, it's not just, I gotta, remember this list. It's about, okay, I gotta do something with this. And so anything you can do in terms of role-playing, case method, anything that makes it seem like a real-world problem is like a huge advance on that kind of rote teaching that they often get in other contexts.
Yeah, and also for the silent situation that you're asking a question and nobody answers, it helps sometimes when you start with a small group settings. So before coming to the main, like the whole class conversation, you give them time, go in your groups, which could be just really sitting, moving their chairs around. So you create these little tiny circles in the classroom, or they just move around, and you say, okay, 15 minutes, discuss it in groups. So there are 5 people discussing it in groups for, let's say, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever time you have. Then you open it up to the whole class. So they have had already 20 minutes to discuss it with 5 people. So they are likely to have something to say now versus complete silence. And maybe there's a speaker of each group, or the more outspoken person is going to represent the group. And so you give time to each group to say. And after the first group, you ask the other groups, agree, disagree, questions for this group. So you're starting to create interaction. And then you open it up completely for everybody. So it's like stepwise to get into the conversation, because you created little conversations and then intergroup conversations, and then finally the whole class may feel more comfortable to be able to be wanting to say something in front of other people. The other thing that I do with the cold calling, if I say, Mary, what do you think? And Mary's, at that moment she's completely, she has nothing to say. I just say, okay, it's okay, I'll get back to you in 10 minutes. So she has 10 minutes to think about something. Or I'll get back to you at the end of the class, or I'll get back to you in 20 minutes. So again, compassion with accountability. I'm compassionate that she seems to have no idea what to say. I already told her that I'm gonna forget. I'm gonna come back to her at the end of the class, and again, not in a scary way, not making feel her like she was terrible. Just, okay, you're blank right now, I'll get back to you, keep thinking. So I don't know if that helps you, but this idea of stepwise groups helps, and this idea of cold calling and giving them a chance to come back to them if they are silent in the moment.
I was just trying to get away from negative reinforcement, because that's the other thing I notice with students today. If there's some sort of negative aspect to, then just like he was saying.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I'm trying to get it to where they want to participate instead of me forcing them to.
Yeah.
Do you have a question? Yeah.
Yes, it's thank you very much. It was very interesting and inspiring. I've been always interested in methods, types of methods to learn and improve, and etc. But I still don't have, I've been teaching 15 years, I still don't have like an answer for this question I would like to ask you. And it's, we have the method case, we have more type lectures classes, we have more choreographing, like directing this debate between students. But sometimes, and I call from these law professor perspectives, sometimes we need to go very high conceptually and go into a lecture to explain something. And it really becomes this, as we say in Europe, clase magistral. This magistral is really the master at it speaking, because and we are transmitting this reasoning of something. We have to analyze, but then sometimes it's just the student that have to solve it. So we really have to be balancing ourselves between one and the other, and sometimes students might not like it when you are just speaking, but listen, students, you really need to get this, where this comes from, this concept is very important, because if not, it's like going with a parachute into something, like they solve it very well, but they don't know how to go backward and find where's the origin. So I really don't know what's the best system to, I really try to combine. I think I keep on evolution, myself keeps on being evolving. I don't have a specific one. Sometimes even if I know that students might mark me, grade me not very well because I see that they are getting bored in this, but they have to go through. It's like an obliged passage for them, and they will see, as Professor Guerra said before, I'm sure they will see this once they will practice. They say, I remember this class when they were telling this that was so boring, but I wasn't understanding why I should do the things how I do. What do you think about these different methods? Are you combining them? Do you really say, no, I prefer lecture no matter what the students say, I prefer just to be more popular?
What's your discipline?
Law.
Law.
I use a lot of different methods in any given class. So there may be times when I need to lecture, and I might say something like, well, I'm going to report to you that this is how this works, right? Because there's some things that I just have to tell them, but not a lot. I mean, a lot of the stuff is going to be in the readings, and I can pull it out of them generally. But sometimes it requires knowing my class. So like with response to the engineering professor, sometimes I can call on someone who I know will know it, or who I know wants to speak. I can tell they want to speak, and then you get through that, and then that'll get someone else. And the other thing that's really interesting that I have found is when I call on students, it could be someone who's normally very quiet, who doesn't raise their hand very much, but I get them talking. Then all of a sudden they become more vocal, like they get comfortable with hearing their voice, and they'll oftentimes come and talk to me after class. All of a sudden they're super engaged. So sometimes if they know that you're going to call on them, but that they can decline if they have to, but this is just part of how we're going to operate. It's not really, I mean, it is forced, but they don't resent it necessarily.
They like having structures.
They like having structure.
They like having
It's
structures.
done respectfully.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that if you need to vary the structures, you can always do that.
Right.
But, I mean, I think it's always synthetic. And it's always based on the need of the people right in front of you and how much sleep they've had
Yeah.
and whether they had breakfast or not. It's performance. A performance is about what you had for breakfast that day. Did you have a good breakfast? If you had a good breakfast, maybe you can think a little bit better than the day before when you didn't have a good breakfast. I mean, there are a lot of contingencies in any performance, but that also means that just like, the stage actor who kind of, has to give the same lines night after night, those crowds are different from night to night, and so you bring different things to each crowd. And so if you're teaching a recurring class, you begin to get a sense of, well, if this happens, then what I do is this. And the older you get, and apparently I'm aging really well, I begin to develop different kinds of techniques depending on different situations that arise as people struggle with, in my case, Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels, which is a fiendishly difficult work that, I know pretty well at this point, and I kind of know the interpretive pitfalls and, slidey slides and, just the different moments that they need to be able to navigate in order to understand something about Swift and Gulliver. So you develop flexibility, you get a situational sense of your material. Like, okay, they're struggling with this, how do I break it down yet further? Or maybe you don't need to break it down with this class. I have a class this term that's understanding stuff that other classes really struggled with in previous semesters. That's fine, we can get into other things. It's a different crowd every day, and then to a certain extent, each class represents a kind of environment that you work within, and you will make certain adjustments to the material as you do that, and you will use different forms of explanation. Great teaching is about learning to say the same thing in innumerable ways. And so you can put it on the board, you can put it on the blog, you can have them do it in groups. You just have all sorts of different ways of doing that.
And can I just say one thing about the performance thing too, because, I used to always be jealous of my colleagues who are really funny. Because students would always, I love that professor, he's so hilarious. And one of the things I sort of figured out by accident, I was teaching a criminal procedure class, and it was about a guy walking down the street with a briefcase, and the police want to search this briefcase. And I didn't plan to do it, I just I just said, okay, so, you know, you're the guy, right? You're walking down the street with the briefcase. And I did that, right, walking around, just kind of doing this thing. And the cop comes up, and the student started laughing. And I said, oh, that's funny, funny too. And what I realized was that I'm not hilarious in the way that my colleague Doug Mall is, who's just a stand-up comic. You know, every other word out of his mouth is hilarious. I'm not like that, but everyone has a sense of humor. Everyone has a personality. And the trick is, again, being authentic, right?
Yes.
And working at it. I had to work on it, because one of the things I noticed with Joel Osteen, you know, the great religious guy, he starts with a joke. Every single Sunday, he starts with a corny joke that has nothing to do with his sermon whatsoever. But it's very effective to wake people up and get them engaged. And so I will actually spend time before every class where I think, what am I going to say that is remotely funny? And you know, that's corny usually, and maybe sometimes it's not funny. Maybe it's just an interesting story about a book I read that had something to do with lawyers, you know, a little inspirational something or other. I have to work at it. I'm not very good at it because I'm not naturally funny, but I do try to find those moments where I can be silly. And I used to worry about, you know, letting them know much about my personal life. And now I tell them things about my family. My mother is the reasonable person. In law, there's, you know, like, we talk about the standard of the reasonable person, and I always talk about my mother. She is the reasonable person. And I tell stories about Mom, you know, that she would be embarrassed probably. But they work.
Yeah.
They work.
Yes, and when you lose the students, right? These are resources when you are seeing that after half an hour of class that you start losing a bit of a concentration sometimes. Maybe
Yeah.
a joke allows the student or a personal note,
Right.
suddenly they leave the heads and they keep on listening a little
Yeah.
bit more.
And about your question with the lectures because I usually don't lecture, I used to tell the students, you're in charge of reading the articles and the chapters. We're gonna start the class right with the case. So 3 hours with the case, no lectures. But then, of course, throughout the years, I decided, you know, they realized they haven't read the articles and they haven't read the chapters. So I maybe should introduce some concepts because they haven't read everything, and I'm assuming that they have read everything so that we can apply it in the case. So I started doing like this tiny little lecture exercise introducing concepts, but even in those, I introduce a couple of concepts, I provide an example, and then immediately I pretend that it's a case. And even for that, I say, does anybody have an example about this? Has this happened to you at work? So even during the lecture time, we're not talking about Starbucks yet or about whatever case we are supposed to talk. For different concepts, like just on Saturday when I was teaching the MBAs, I was talking about causal ambiguity and social complexity and path dependency. So I explain the concept, provide an example, and then have you seen this in your companies? Has this ever happened to you? So they immediately raise their hands, yes, this happened in my company. So the lecture becomes like a mini real life case, even before you get to the...
Getting them to provide their own examples
Yeah.
is really key to engagement, because especially if you can just sort of say, you know, in your own lives. I mean, we're talking about Swift, but if we want to talk about concepts of sexuality or, you know, brutality, coercion, whatever fun stuff Swift is talking about, you know, we can have them kind of, you know, pull stuff out of the news or the internet or movies or whatever it is. Give me an example of this. And the activity of, you know, kind of thinking and then offering an example is, you know, an immediate sort of boost to engagement. So their ability to kind of provide those kinds of examples are 1,000 times more effective than me saying, well, look at X, look at Y, look at Z. That's me just talking more. So anything that gets them kind of giving me matter to use in the class is good.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, so, thank you, yes, I appreciate very much the perspectives and hopefully one day I'll be sitting there. So as somebody who's an assistant professor in anthropology and just starting, I wanted to speak a little bit to some of the things that you guys mentioned, which I think I've been thinking a lot about as well, and learning that when you want to do more engaged or discussion oriented, you have to be really committed to it. Because if you just kind of throw it in and you don't commit to it, then they won't commit to it either. And there are different ways I think that you can do that. That I've tried to do it, working it into my syllabus. So I teach, because I teach medical anthropology course, I teach a lot of pre-med students anthropological concepts. And so sometimes I need them to understand how a concept is particularly anthropological and why, how that's different from sociology or something else. So it's hard for me to get past the lecture, but I want to because I talk a lot, and so I need to work in the discussion. So this semester I started dividing it. So one day I lecture, Tuesdays I lecture, and Thursdays it's only discussion. And they know that. And there's discussion that happens in the lecture as well, but the discussion that happens on Thursdays, they have to bring examples, they have to connect the concepts. And it's all them, we sit in a circle, and it's a very different dynamic, and it's part of their grade. So there's a lot of different ways in which I'm committed to that discussion, and I'm holding them accountable for it. Also, when there's silence, you have to sit in silence sometimes. And let it be really awkward. Really awkward.
But sometimes silence is them processing.
Because sometimes they're processing, right? Some people process things very quickly and other people don't. And so you just have to be comfortable sitting in that silence, and I think that's also committing to it. Eventually somebody's gonna talk, but you have to, I think that's part of the commitment. And I'm wondering, as I'm thinking, this semester I've been trying to think more creatively about assignments. Specifically thinking about how to get them to work harder in the classroom and not just have all the work be outside of the classroom, but also for my own workload. And so my question is specifically, how do you handle the workload, especially when you're trying to have lots of creative assignments and lots of engaged assignments, and then you're kind of on the receiving end of grading all of those things. So how do you balance that?
Nobody says they have to be graded.
Right. That's the first,
okay.
yeah, that's the first rule of workload, is that you are creating your own workload,
Yeah.
Well, I
right?
feel like they expect, I
No.
feel like when they don't get a lot of.
Yeah, but I mean, but they're not teaching the class, you are.
Right.
And so you have to be able to, and this is something that everybody struggles with.
Right.
But you are creating the workload. The more you grade, the more you are calling upon yourself to put in the hours of, evaluating and providing feedback.
Okay.
So what I try to do is make sure that the things that I provide feedback on are going to be critical things, crucial things, not everything, but just the things that are really crucial for them learning whatever it is that we need to learn for the purposes of the course. But if they just need a kind of temperature taking kind of thing, then a lot of group work, a lot of low stakes writing, there's just loads and loads of things you can do where the most useful feedback they get is from their peers. Do a parent share, ask a question. They write for 2 minutes and then they swap with a classmate. They look at each other's answers, they discuss it, they report out. Anything that they tell each other is going to be 1,000 times more effective than what I say. And then it's also going to be kind of a moment where they are kind of learning from their fellow students. Group work is a really, really good way to give them a more structured kind of feedback, because you're not reading 5 essays, you're reading one, say, annotated bibliography. Annotated bibliographies are a way to cut down workload, because instead of a research paper, you're making them do the steps towards a research project without doing it all the way. So you're giving them practice in research without having to read somebody's 20-page research essay. So thinking pretty ruthlessly about your own workload is how you get to be more effective about their workload and putting it where it's most effective. Because you don't need to be commenting about everything. I mean, sometimes the best thing is for them to kind of, comment on each other and then move on. And then the other principle in all this is that you are not actually the person shoving things into their heads. What you're basically doing is giving them opportunities to learn stuff. And so throwing the burden onto them to contextualize things themselves through their own readings and then certain kinds of assignments are way more effective than me trying to kind of just
shove every single detail about a particular kind of question, into their heads via lecture. So getting them to do annotated bibs, getting them to do certain kinds of reports, getting them to basically interact with the readings and then using that as preparation rather than me telling them is another way to push off the workload onto them rather than onto me.
And I have an example of what you just said that works very well in my classes. So in all, or pretty much in all of my classes, there is an assignment where they have to interview somebody. Okay, so for global leadership. So they have to find a global leader somewhere, and which can be, I tell them, can be somebody that if they are working, somebody that works in your company, it can be a family member, your father, your mother. So many people have interviewed their fathers and they're so excited that, I never knew my dad was doing all these things, and apparently he was traveling all over the world being a global leader and I didn't know. So sometimes it's very personal where they tell me that they found out by doing this interview and their father, sometimes they interview their mother, global leader too. And for ethical leadership, they have to interview also somebody about an ethical issue at work and apply the frameworks from class. So these sounds like silly assignments, but they love them and they love to have to talk to somebody. Because sometimes they say, we realize that what we are talking in class actually is happening out there. Or what the book is saying is actually happening out there. So there's a connection between the theory and the practice. Sometimes I tell them to interview in their company the person who has the job that they would like to have one day. So that they are making contacts, they're learning about jobs, they're having to talk to people and put themselves out there saying, I would love to have an international assignment to whatever part of the world, or I would love to become a country manager. They have to say what they want. So it's really, so the grading, sometimes the students say, how are you going to grade these interviews? Like our student who really was worried about the grade. I said, it's not that the interview is going to be right or wrong. And there cannot be a grown answer if this is an interview. They do have a section on lessons, what are my takeaways from the interview that I can put in practice. So I tell them, I'm not going to grade an interview as good interview or bad interview. It's really just the thoughtfulness of your takeaways, the thoughtfulness in terms of the question answer. And I give them the interview protocol for the global leadership one. For the other one, it's a little bit more open. There's another paper, so the grading is not hard in the sense that my intention is not to put a bad grade on the interview unless they didn't do it or they asked one question instead of, So my intention is not necessarily that I'm going to grade them hard on the interview. My intention is for them to go through that process of having to find somebody, having to talk to somebody, having to think and listen about all these experiences, having to think about them, having to apply them to themselves and their own career plans, etc. So I'm not too worried in those assignments about having diversity of grades. I'm worried about having them go through that process and the learning that is going to go for them, having to be out there talking to strangers that they have never talked before. So some of my assignments are like that where I don't worry about having a grade distribution. I'm worried about them going out there.
So one of the things I do, I tell them right up front, this is an ungraded but mandatory assignment. You must turn it in. I'm not going to grade it. And there are some assignments I don't even give them any feedback on it. I just want them to have gone through the process. And I tell them, I am looking for a good faith effort that is timely. That's what's required. And the example that is, I'm trying to teach them theories of punishment, right? Why do we punish people? And so I make them do a sentencing memorandum. You are the judge, here's the case. You decide the sentence and explain it using the terminology that lawyers and judges have to use, right? And I can't really grade that, there's no right or wrong. It's like the interviews, there's not really a right or wrong, but I want them to have gone through, and so by doing that, I'm teaching them what I want on the exam, because they're gonna have to use this terminology in discussing as prosecutors why they would charge someone with a crime. But also, I'm helping them to make the connection between this theory and this terminology and what judges do. But I don't grade it,
A lot of the stuff, it's interesting that basically you got two people who are working in applied fields, and then I actually teach as if I'm in an applied field.
Right.
And what happens is that the connection between the stuff we study in life is huge. It's the main reason why we're all doing it. And that means that you're not hunting for errors.
in grading, you want them to kind of do something and to produce something that's representative of their effort. And so that is kind of the key. I have them do portfolios, which we could talk about, but everything you're describing is basically, completion grades. And there might be a kind of final paper, but that's different than
Yeah.
everything else you're doing. So making it a selective thing, we're gonna do, at the very end, we'll do a kind of final essay. It doesn't have to be 20 pages long either, that kind of reflects your thinking. How much work you've done, how much development you've had over the semester.
So, I just wanted to add, one of the things I do is I try to do cumulative assignments, and so the small assignments that I do throughout the semester, they build up strategies and knowledge for the final assignment, so it's not just a final assignment out of nowhere. So if it's a larger paper, then there's small papers that are, so, it's difficult then not to give feedback sometimes if they're not, and sometimes the good faith effort is really bad. And if I don't say something, then they'll turn in something bad again, and they'll keep turning in something bad, and then when the final comes up, they don't understand why they didn't do well.
Right.
And then they get frustrated, and those are the kinds of comments I see on my evaluations. But I think everything you're saying is legitimate. I think it's just a matter of being clear with them, what things won't be graded and what things will
Well,
look.
the other thing is it doesn't have to factor into their final grade, right? So you can give like, this is satisfactory S, you
Right.
get an S.
Yeah.
This is not, this is needs work, and give it back as needs work. And it's not, so you don't have to finally calculate how many points and
Right.
then factor that into the final grade, which is much harder to do for you.
Yeah, there's good, there's fine, there's needs work.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see there's been a hand up. over
Yes,
there.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
And on this topic, I'm personally trying to fight this idea of credits as currency, but I'm not being very successful. It seems it's very hard to make students move if they know that something that is not worth points. To the point that I'm in Spanish programming, and I had a 30% attendance to the programming lab, which is where they
Learn.
code, because there was no mandatory attendance, and so I had to give them I have to start giving exercise worth some points, so that they would go and do the programming part of their programming class. So, and even when it's like, you say like, okay, I'm not gonna grade, I'm gonna give a score or a feedback, I still have to give them something if they do it, or a penalty if they don't. But, so personally, I really don't like this. I think that if I have to force you to do something that you're here to learn, and it's such a core component, then there is something missing. So I'd like to hear from you if you have ideas on how to reach them and make them understand that they have to practice because it's good and not because they get points, or if this is just, okay, this is a lost battle. Just give them something.
Just go home.
And it's fantastic because if you give them something like 1 point, they will do it. Like nothing, but
If it's for extra credit points,
they really do it.
they will do it.
Can I ask you, is this a required course for other kinds of majors? Are the people who are this resistant, are they taking your course so they can do some other kind of field, or are they actually taking your course to kind of move,
It's
advance it?
both.
It's
So we get both.
Okay, so, the required course always has worse evaluations and always has less motivation than the course that actually fits in with people's kind of aspirations and goals. That's kind of a built-in thing. And then the other issue is that you're talking about people who are working not from any desire for learning, but from just a desire to get the kind of credit for it. And we call that strategic learning, where you only learn as much for as long as it takes for you to get the grade and move on. And frankly, most high school and middle school kind of teaching is geared that way. So deep learning is not particularly valued, except that when you get to our level,
No, but
you have to start doing
I
it.
think what I hear her saying is something different, and I think that our students are rational actors. They are totally rational. They have a lot of things going on in their lives.
All right.
And anything that is totally optional to them is a luxury that they cannot afford. That's how I view it. I mean, our attendance is mandatory in law school. They must attend. If they miss more than a certain percentage of classes, they are dropped. And I raise that for my small classes, because, you know, I consider that so important that they have to show up. So my students will show up. If I announce that, you know, class on Friday is optional, I'll get 10 people.
Yeah.
You know, they'll ask me, are you gonna record it? And if I say yes, I'll get 10 people there out of 90.
You have to be careful
You know,
about
so-
labeling things optional.
Yeah, I
I
mean,
wouldn't do it.
it's not optional, they gotta show up.
The point that I'm thinking of is, how do I get them to understand that programming practice is not optional in a programming class? So if you don't go, yeah, nobody's gonna chase you down, but it's still very damaging toward your future homeworks and your future final. And so yes, you don't get penalty because you didn't attend, but eventually it's gonna get you.
They're not gonna be able to get a job, because all programming jobs are done by, here's your problem, write the program for me, so.
But I don't want to make, that's the thing, I really would like to avoid, if possible, making it mandatory attendance, because I would rather have them think, make that connection that even though they don't get penalized today, on the long run, it's gonna.
Can you make them turn in a log? Say, you know, I'm gonna require for this semester that you have to spend 20 hours in the lab practicing, and I wanna see the log. You know, you have to, when you sign in, when you sign
Have
out.
a real pledge.
With some flexibility.
Curtis, you had
I teach a class that has a similar component to it, and my general philosophy on that is, at least in your class, if those optional assignments help them perform on a mandatory assignment, then they're more likely to do it. And if they don't, and they don't do well on the mandatory assignment, now when they come to you to have a conversation about it, it is, well, hey, you had an opportunity to do this, get feedback from me, and hone your skill, and you chose not to do it. So where are we now?
The
And
connection
I have a class that literally, the grades are tied to their performance in something, but they have assignments that they need to turn in, for which I give them feedback, and I'm very clear, do it or don't. But, you know, there's an end thing on it. If you can do all this and get the grade that you want at the end because you're gifted or whatever, or you get it and you don't need these assignments, the feedback, that's great. But if you fall on your face, you have the opportunity for me to provide the feedback to you that you needed. So now they are taking ownership of their learning instead of you taking ownership of their learning.
I think the other disparity that we have to keep in mind is, you know, she's speaking about law school classes, she's speaking about master's classes, I know Dave's probably speaking about undergraduate classes, but a lot of us are talking about undergraduate courses, and they can be freshmen and sophomores, and the difference is, you're the expert. You have the foresight to know later down the road that this is going to kill them if they don't do it. They don't see that, they just go, oh, it's optional. It's not going to affect me later. She would have made it mandatory if it were going to affect me later. So what are your options? Either it has to be mandatory or they fail. They learn the hard way, right? I get what you want to do, but you know, we're in the same situation. We have a ton of freshmen who just figure, yay, I'm in college. I don't have to show up if I don't want to. Don't tell my parents. Okay, but they don't understand the data either. And just showing up and sitting there and listening is correlated with better student success. They're not presented with the data oftentimes, let alone they you know, it sounds very textbook, but they don't know that.
I mean, a lot of students make the transition from high school to college without understanding how much more self-motivated they have to be to succeed in college. I mean, in high school, basically, you know, they can take 6 months to read a 300-page book. But in college, you'll get 3 books that have to be read by the following week, and you do that on your own. And this is the kind of thing that causes attrition, because students arrive and they have no idea that
they have to kind of maintain a kind of constant schedule and put in those hours of homework and the rest of it to even pass their course.
Yeah,
So,
and we go to what are we? What is the target of ours as professors? At the undergrad, maybe it's to educate stronger, instead to build this brain, because they just went out from high school, they don't know how they have to work, they know that these are mandatory things. I know sometimes I feel like I'm a policeman, I don't want to be a policeman, because I'm there to teach, so if they don't want to do it, it's their business. But at the same time, we have to help them and to tutorize them. And that's why they grade us better, right? The more you personalize the student, suddenly he grades you better than this class that you get lost in the middle of. And then as far as you move on and you are in master class, listen, students, you don't even say kids, listen students, you have to do this. If you don't do it, it's your problem, it's your business. I mean, I'm not going to follow you behind with a stick, you have to do this, you have to do it, right? So I think there's an evolution according to the age of student that we are. I think I would see it that way.
Thank you guys very much. We're right about a little bit before 1. Thank you so much for coming. Dale?
My name's Dale Root. I'm the chair of the Faculty Engagement and Development Center Advisory Board. I'd like us all to give John a round of applause for the magnificent job she's done.
Thank you. Please take the other stuff is catered, but the cookies and the cheesecake I made. So please take extras if you like.